We're all familiar with, I hope, the importance of gratitude, hakar tov, having appreciation for people who do good things for us, saying thank you when it's appropriate. However, I think there are a number of sources that point out that while that's true, there may be an additional and deeper dimension to the significance of hakar tov from the Torah's perspective. The great medieval work of philosophy and Musar, the Chovas Halavavos, points out that not only is it important to be self-aware enough to appreciate all of the many, many kindnesses and blessings that God has given in our lives, that's step one, but he says, mayhem, but by going through that process, becoming aware, self-reflective enough, and appreciating all the blessings that God has bestowed upon us, Yikabel avodaso ba'avuram, through that awareness of all the things that Hashem has done for us, ba'avuram, because of that, Yikabel avodaso, we'll have a commitment to Hashem, will keep the Torah. In other words, what is the Chovas Halavavos saying in a few short words? That the moral backbone, the moral basis, the moral imperative to keep the Torah, to follow Hashem's ways, to be a devoted Jew, the basis of that, the moral responsibility devolves upon us. Why? Ultimately, out of a sense of gratitude. If we have a hakar tov for everything Hashem has done for us, it follows that we need to quote-unquote pay him back by doing what he's asked us to do. Another great work of medieval Jewish thought, the Shari Tshuva of Rabbeinu Yonah, points out that the flip side is really true, and it's not the opposite, it's more just the flip side of the same coin. He points out it's not just that hakar tov is part of every mitzvah that we're doing, but the opposite is true. Anytime we sin, whether we realize it or not, in every sin that we do, whether it's large or small, there's an element of being a kafui tov, of being an ingrate, of not having gratitude. After all, if we genuinely had gratitude towards Hashem, how could we rebel against him? How could we spit in his face, as it were, and sin if we really had as much gratitude as we ought to have? Not only that, but as the Tomer Devorah, a more Kabbalistically oriented work, points out, every time we sin, the very moment we're sinning, we're using the blessings and the strengths and the talents and abilities Hashem has given us to rebel and spit in his face. For example, Hashem gave us the gift of speech. And if we abuse that gift, not only are we doing something wrong, but we're doing something wrong with the very gifts that Hashem has given us. What greater demonstration of ingratitude, of being a kafui tov, could there be than that? So, first of all, this is already a very important insight for us to have. That gratitude, hakar tov, is not just something that's been on the chavero. It's not just about saying thank you and being polite. There's a spiritual dimension to it as well, in part of our relationship with Hashem. But I think a number of sources, including some very fascinating psukim in our parsha, will demonstrate that there may even be something more to it than that. In Perek Chav Gimel, we read in psukim Daled through Hey that if someone would convert from the ancient nations of Ammon and Moab, they can never truly marry into the Jewish people. They can never integrate fully into the Jewish people. And the Torah tells us why. Because when we were leaving Egypt, we just needed some bread, some water, we need some basic sustenance, and the ancient peoples of Ammon and Moab wouldn't help us. That act of cruelty that they demonstrated to us all the way back then, the Torah testifies, on a subtle level, is ingrained in all of their descendants. It can never truly be expunged, and therefore we don't want that dimension of cruelty ever to creep into the Jewish people. As perhaps hard or that is to understand, or surprising as that is to the modern ear, the problem is really when we continue reading a few psukim later, because in Pasuk Ches we read that another nation, the ancient Egyptians, if someone would convert from them, Lotus Aiv Mitzri, Higer Ha'isa Ba'artzo. There we don't despise that person, we don't hold anything against them at all, can marry right in, totally integrate. After all, we were once upon a time Ger Ha'ita Ba'artzo. We were strangers in their land. In other words, they took us in, they hosted us for 200 plus years. We had to have hakar tov, as Rashi points out, because the Egyptians took care of us for all those years. But let's think about that for a second. Does that make any sense? We're more accepting of the descendant of Egypt than we are of Ammon and Moab. What the Egyptians did to us is much worse than what Ammon and Moab did. But it's not only that it's much worse. What kind of hakar tov do we have to the Egyptians? They weren't allowing us to stay in their nation because they were good people, altruistically. They did it because we were the backbone of their economy. First Yosef with his wisdom, and then cheap slave labor, which held up their economy and built their pyramids. They weren't doing it because they were nice people or altruistically. They had selfish reasons. And yet, we're told we have to have hakar tov to them for that. How do we understand that? Another question. We know that Moshe was told he couldn't be the direct instrument to bring the first 3 plagues. He couldn't hit the river to bring the blood of the frogs, and he couldn't hit the desert sand to bring out the lice. Why? Chazal famously teach us, Rashi quotes it in Parsha Shmos, because these things saved Moshe's life. When he was a baby, he was protected by the river, and when he killed the Egyptian policeman, it hid the dead body and allowed him opportunity to escape to Midian. And therefore he had to have a kar satov. Moshe had gratitude towards the desert, towards the river, therefore he couldn't hit it. Many of us remember learning this already when we were in kindergarten, a very young age. And it's a very sweet teaching. But let's think about it for a second. It makes no sense. What does that mean to say Moshe has gratitude towards an inanimate object? He can't hit the river all those years later. He can't hit the desert all those years later because once upon a time something good in his life happened through the river, through the desert. Hakara satov, gratitude towards an inanimate object. What does that mean? So I think the answer to both of these questions can be found in a teaching that is mentioned by both Yonasan Eibshitz in the Yaros Dvash, as well as the Mechtav Me'eliyahu. We have to realize, they say, that Hakara satov is in fact a defining aspect of who we are. It's a midah b'nefesh, and either you have it or you don't have it. It's not something that can be just turned on or off, and it certainly can't be borrowed. We have to cultivate looking at life through gratitude eyes, if you will, through rose-colored glasses in the sense of always with gratitude. If you go through life thinking, iskimtmir, magiali, everything comes to me, then you won't be grateful to another person or to Hashem. But if you realize that everything ultimately comes from Hashem, bashkacha pratis, and I really deserve nothing, everything is a kindness that's being done to me by God or through His messengers, people in my life, then I will have gratitude. And the nature of gratitude is either you have it or you don't. And therefore we have to be grateful, the Torah teaches us, to everyone and even everything. Because once we start being ungrateful to certain things, it'll cascade to other things. We must be grateful to everything so we can develop and have this midah for everything.